Welcome back, Chappelle. All right. So, great job today. Great job on your first day of block. Great job on your first flip. Great discussions in class today. I'm super, super excited about this group of y'all. I think it's going to be great, okay, this year. We're going to have a great year, and it's going to be awesome. So let's pick off where we left off in class. So where we left off in class, we were talking kind of like loosely about the Egyptians, right? We had talked about the Sumerians. We talked about the Babylonians. We had talked about kind of like Hammurabi's Code and like this origin of idea of law and things like that. So we really started to dive deep into these ancient civilizations, right? We kind of talked about what is a civilization. We talked about our Eurocentristic kind of tendencies, Western versus Eastern, things like that today. Covered a lot, covered a ton. And like I said, loved how y'all grouped together and did a lot of really cool stuff. Now, the main thing we got to get into now, though, is, of course, reviewing over Egypt a little bit. You know, we were talking about no city-states in Egypt, right? Whereas Mesopotamia was a bunch of city-states that kind of grew and fluctuated with power. Egypt was one centralized kingdom, actually along the Nile River in Africa, okay? And if you actually look at a map of ancient Egypt right now, you can actually see where the entire kingdom of Upper and Lower Egypt, actually, the Upper and Lower Kingdoms, span along the entire Nile River, as you can see right here, Memphis being their capital. I know some of you are like, Memphis is in Tennessee. Well, actually, the name itself comes from the capital of ancient Egypt, right? So we talked about their government, a pharaoh, and theocracy, and how like religion and government like interplay together because they viewed their pharaoh as an extension of their god Ra, right? So we talked about bureaucratic systems, which is like a stratified, multi-level government that's got multiple individuals that have certain jobs, yeah? So, and we talked about how our government, the modern day era, has that. We talked also about a really neat thing about the particular Egyptian qualities of a higher status of women in their government and higher status of women, for the most part, in Egyptian society, as compared to the roles of women in some of the other societies that we will talk about later, particularly when we talk about Rome and Greece. Okay, we'll talk about a very famous female leader in the era of Rome because her and Julius Caesar used to date a little bit. Now, anyway. So, hieroglyphic alphabet, we talked about their writing system, the creation of papyrus, right, first paper, and then we got into their religion a little bit. They're polytheistic, they believe in an afterlife of sorts. We talked about what that looks like. We also talked really cool little bits about the mummification process. And if we didn't get to any of this stuff in your particular class, just let me know, and we'll make sure we go over it a little bit in class as well, right? So, but Egypt is one that everybody knows a lot about. Everybody's seen the pyramids. Everybody's seen a movie that like kind of samples from Egyptian culture. Now, these other smaller kingdoms are ones that not a lot of people know about, right? Not a lot of people. We got to cover 4 of them, all right? We've got to cover 4 of them. We're getting particularly into the Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, and then the Persians, all right? So these ancient civilizations are all the civilizations that predate what we talked about in class, that Western versus Eastern split in cultures and understanding, yeah? So whereas America is a Western civilization, and you could say somewhere like India or China is an Eastern traditional civilization, before all that came people like the Mesopotamians, i.e. Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, we don't talk about them, and several others, but there were other smaller kingdoms as well. It's not like just these gigantic Mesopotamian regions and Egyptians were the only ones that existed. So the smaller ones, there are 3, and then the last ones we'll talk about, the Persians, actually were very, very large. All right, so now these smaller ones include, first and foremost, these people, the Hebrews. So the Hebrews are a little bit of a different, smaller kingdom when you actually look at them. Now they were their own population, and they contributed a lot of very, very interesting new ideas to this smaller kingdom setup, to the expanse of history and the influx into Western civilizations. But the Hebrews serve as kind of a different little bit of a tale. The Hebrews is much more of a sad, kind of somber tale, and then also their biggest contribution to cultures happens to be their belief structure, right? So the Hebrews, also known as the Canaanites, right? So the Canaanites are going to show up around circa 1500 BC. They may or possibly be an offshoot of a smaller or larger group of people in the Mesopotamian region, but they would eventually go and settle in what is now modern-day Israel, or Canaan, right? Their promised land. So the Hebrews, okay, modern-day Israel area, so they were the very first major monotheistic religion. Now, all the other religions that we talked about up to this point are polytheistic, right? They have multiple gods, whereas the Hebrews were not. They actually created the Judaic faith or the Jewish faith, right? So, what is their holy book? And if any of y'all know anything about the faith of Judaism, if you don't and you have questions, write them down real quick. Come in and ask me tomorrow. We'll talk about it. We'll expand on it a little bit. But the Judaic faith has been something that has lasted for thousands of years, and it's almost twice the age of Christianity, right? Starting again, like I said, with the Hebrews and the Canaanites. And the Judaic faith, of course, gives the biggest bulk to the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, right? So, but what is their holy book? Do they use the Bible? But if some of their book is in the Old Testament, well, what does that exactly relate to? Well, a lot of people believe that their holy book is called the Torah, which it actually isn't. Their real whole holy book is called the Tanakh, right? So the Tanakh is a large book. It's actually not even a book, technically. It's a scroll that actually can be completely unraveled, and it actually is meant to be sang whenever it's being spoken out loud. The Torah is only 1/3 of it. It's only 1/3 of it. And it includes the very first 5 books of the Holy Christian Bible, right? It's it's Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Exodus, Genesis, and Numbers, all right? Like those are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, all of those being borrowed from the ancient Hebrew people. Again, those people from the ancient Canaan area or the modern-day Israel era, right? Area. Now, they are a very small culture, very, very tiny, and they would begin what is known as this word right here. Underline it, circle it, highlight it, because I know a lot of y'all are like, wait a second, Mr. Terry. If they were in Israel this whole time, and then they're this ancient civilization of people, then how the heck did they end up in Europe during World War II? How did they end up in Europe during the Middle Ages? How did they end up in America now if they're an ancient culture that originates from that particular area of the world? Well, due to the fact that they were so small, they were often subject to being taken over by larger, growing empires. And we'll talk about one of those people in particular here in a few minutes. One of the guys that's caused the diaspora of the Hebrew people. These smaller cultures are subject to these larger ones who are learning how to wage war a little bit more effectively than they are, right? And the Hebrews never really effectively tried to wage war. They were much more of an economic standard kind of group. They actually had a very specific social structure where a man would actually learn a specific trade or craft, right? i.e. jeweling or banking or lending or dentistry, if they had it at the time, or tool making, and they would then pass that gift on to their sons, and they would actually continue this entire idea of educating their sons in these smaller communities. Well, this smaller culture, who was not very apt in war, was very easy to take over. And when they were taken over, this thing called the diaspora occurred. And after they were taken over by multiple other groups, the diaspora is where they spread out, trying to look for safety. Right? So some people believe that they may have ended up in Egypt after their first diaspora and actually have been subject to slavery in Egypt during the 18th dynasty and the Egyptian New Kingdom era. This, of course, leading to the Exodus book, right, of Moses and actually leaving of Egypt, right, the fleeing of Egypt of the slaves. However, there's not any historical evidence that ever actually happened. However, the diaspora is something that we know for sure 1,000% occurred. And it actually definitely relates to that Exodus story, that diaspora, that movement of these people, because their promised land in the modern-day Israel area was taken over. So, and then you've got the Phoenicians. Phoenicians are wildly important, right? The Phoenicians are very important because they gave you a phonetic alphabet. Words are not related, but still, it's important to know. The Phoenicians are a really, really neat group. They are a society of traders. Some of y'all are going to immediately be like, where are the pictures of all these people? Where's all their big ziggurats and stuff like that? Well, these are the harder ones. The smaller kingdoms are a little bit more difficult to kind of throw up images of themselves due to the fact that they were so small. They actually didn't necessarily have a lot of large artifacts left over. Now, this particular one, the Phoenicians, which are going to show up around circa 2500 BC, even before the Hebrews themselves actually arose, are a master shipbuilding and trading class. We believe that they originated in what is now modern-day Lebanon. all right? Lebanon, the Beirut area of Lebanon. Now, I'm sure some of y'all have heard the massive explosion that occurred there this past week, right? So Lebanon, of course, being very close to Israel, the Israel era, right above them, but they were master shipbuilders that created many small settlements around the Mediterranean because they had a diaspora of their own. When Phoenician kingdoms, if they were ever under attack or ever under subjugation, they would just leave. They would just pop on these ships that they could build very well, and then they would just go set up another site, another trading post, and they were kind of a people on the move, right? Now the Phoenicians, though, because of this genius, because they were such good traders, earned themselves the name by the Greeks, the purple people. That's where the word Phoenician comes from. It means purple people, because the Phoenicians were the only people in the world that traded a purple cloth, right? A purple cloth that we believe they might have actually made from ground up snail shells, right? So anyway, they earned themselves the name purple people by the Greeks because they were the only ones that traded this particular colored cloth to the Greeks, right? And so, funny enough though, wait a second, let's reel it back. If the Phoenicians are running around with master shipbuilding techniques and they're trading with the Greeks, when they popped up almost 1,000 years later, then how the heck did they communicate with them? How are you going to talk? You're just going to be like, oh, this, you want that, and just trade these things back and forth? Well, the really interesting thing is that for Western civilizations, for the entirety of Western civilizations, the Phoenicians set a standard when they created the very first phonetic alphabet. The phonetic alphabet is the one we use now. A sounds like ah, and B sounds like buh, and C sounds like k, and like all this other shenanigans, right? Now, the phonetic alphabet is based completely on sound, right? The sound and the blending together of letters. And that particular alphabet would then be diffused to the Greeks. The Greeks would adopt the phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians, and then they would actually begin to make their own outlined off of this particular alphabet right here. And back it up. This is the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, as you can see, has some modern day words or letters that we're very, very used to, right? They're very, very understand. Like H still, like literally H showed up when it was originally created to look like a fence because they thought the word fence started with an H-like sound, right? So, and then like as you can see, the letter H is thousands of years old. So is the letter Z. The structure for the N is almost very, very similar. L's as well, the K. Like as you can see, they had all of these interesting things that kind of actually endured throughout time. The A, Aleph, also in their language for ox, is actually just going to be slightly turned over to create the A symbol that we use now. The neatest part about this thing, though, is that they only had 21 letters, give or take, and they had no consonants, right? So vowel sounds were assumed. The Greeks added the vowels into that alphabet, right? After they took this and they edited it and made it their own, right? So the phonetic alphabet is very important in the society of trading, right? So Assyrians are also wildly important as well. Now, the Assyrians are the big jerks of the entire small kingdom era in ancient civilizations. Now, the Assyrians, circa 2600 BC, right around 2600 BC, they are going to be this warrior-like culture, right? They're going to be the ones that kind of cause the diaspora of the Hebrew people, a second diaspora of them anyway. The Babylonians caused the first one. They were a warrior-like culture, though. Born out of this area at the base of the Zagros Mountains, right over here. This is, the Assyrian Empire actually built itself up right here from a couple of small settlements, one of them being Nineveh, that you don't need to know that, but they were a very small settlement at first. So they were a small kingdom at first. But then they learned how to do some amazing things, like create this military technology that nobody had ever seen, right? They learned how to wield iron. No one had ever seen iron before. Most of the people during this time period are still using bronze, right? And we will talk about that when we get into the Greeks, when we talk about their early birth in the Bronze Age, right? So, and then we'll talk about how that collapsed and stuff. But they actually learned how to wield iron first. They created the first libraries, and they were very, very, very well known for their military tactics. They were the very first people to have a professional army. Go ahead and jot that down at the very, very bottom, that fourth bullet point, right? Professional army. A professional army meaning that someone's job or occupation is to wage war. You are a soldier literally as a job. That is how you get paid. That is how you provide for your family, right? And these professional armies are going to have ranks and certain duties. They would have shield men that had these really, really big shields that archers would stand behind and then like sit by and just like let everything go. And also, they were a very extreme warrior-like culture in the sense that they actually were very well known for making examples out of fallen armies. So as you can see, this right here, their warrior-like culture. We'll show you the example of these like fallen armies here in a second. But the Assyrians were a very, very, not chaotic or violent, i.e., but they were a very intense civilization that actually like made a business of taking over most of the Fertile Crescent area. So they started out right here, and everything shaded in green is areas that the Assyrians took over, right? It was a very intense group, and they would do things like this. This was a punishment that they would actually do to some city officials. It's called flaying. It's really messed up, where they would actually try to make examples out of city officials that they took over in a very intense execution style that we will talk about tomorrow. And I will see you guys then, all right? Because tomorrow we're going to talk about the Persians a little bit. I want to save them, actually, because I don't feel that like I ever get the point fully across with those guys. But we'll see you then, okay? I'll talk to you guys later.